You may give her a round of applause. It is my privilege, Professor Davis, Ms. Davis, to welcome you and to express our thanks to you for honoring the Sorbonne Nouvelle with your visit this evening. Many of us here have enthused over that prospect for weeks, for we all know that Angela Davis is no ordinary guest. On my way here, I thought of the moving poem and tribute Prévert wrote in your support in August 1971, entitled Angela Davis. Sa tête, sa jolie tête était mise à prix aux enchères du malheur. Je recommande le poème à ceux qui ne le connaissent pas. You are an icon of what historians have called the longest decade, the 60s and early 70s, and your lifetime commitment to the struggle against all forms of oppression has won you the respect and admiration all over the world of people of all political persuasions. You have been a beacon and a shining example for many successive generations. But above all, you were from the start in the forefront of the fight to pull down race, gender, and class barriers. And I can't resist quipping that the full measure of your success and victories was given by the famous and infamous enemies you made for yourself: Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, J. Edgar Hoover. Again, thank you for being here, and welcome to Paris, to the Latin Quarter, and to the Sorbonne. I also take this opportunity to thank my young colleagues of the Organization and Technical Committee and Jour de Fête for their invaluable help. I will now give the floor, without further ado, to our University President, Marie-Christine Lemardelet.
Angela Davis, I want to thank you for your visit to our university, which is to us not only a pleasure, but an honor. You come on the occasion of Shola Lynch's documentary on how you made history in the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s by your commitment to the cause of justice, civil rights, women's emancipation, freedom of speech, and the defense of political prisoners. The film is an eloquent portrait of the militant you've always been and still are, born in Alabama, educated in New York and Europe, France and Germany, a member of the Communist Party and a young professor of philosophy at UCLA, fired by employers under pressure from California Governor Ronald Reagan, then unjustly charged with conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder following Jonathan Jackson's dramatic daylight abduction of Judge Harold Haley from the Marin County Courthouse, which ended with Jackson, Haley, and 2 others dead in a shootout with police. You were then targeted for the electric chair as the embodiment of what was the worst nightmarish radical combination for the establishment at the time: a communist, an Afro-American, a woman, and an outspoken, fearless intellectual to boot. All of us here are impressed by what you have achieved, and I wish to extend to you a hearty welcome on behalf of my colleagues and of our students, especially all the young ones, the young people who look up to you and admire you. I add a little private note. As I told you as you came in, there are at least 2 generations in the room, and some of us have known you from a very early age. So thank you for being here tonight, Angela Davis. They are in the room, fellow activists and still active feminists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to spend a short time in conversation with you here at the Sorbonne, which I attended some 50 years ago. I was trying to calculate in my mind when I studied here for a year, and I was spending my junior year abroad at what was then called l'École de préparation et de perfectionnement de professeurs de français à l'étranger. I know, it's a mouthful. But it's really wonderful to be here on the occasion of the release of the documentary made by Shala Lynch, who's here with us as well. And I thank you both for the wonderful introductions. I am going to try to speak for about 10 minutes. I was asked to speak for 10 minutes. I think we want to try to devote the majority of the hour we have for conversation. So let me say that, well, I'll talk about the film a bit and use that as the context for addressing some contemporary issues. When Shala first approached me about doing a film, I was reluctant because I didn't want to bring more attention to myself than already exists in the world. And I can tell you that after my trial was over, I figured out that I would be in the public light for maybe 2 or 3 years. I assumed that the attention span was about 2 or 3 years. Then I could go back doing the work, my scholarly work, and doing my activist work in anonymity. And as it turned out, it didn't happen that way. So I wasn't really that interested in bringing more attention to myself individually. But when we talked about the project, and Shala said that it would focus on the trial and on the movement, then it made sense to produce a film that might have some impact on younger generations in the second decade of the 21st century. What was most important about that time in relationship to my own case was not so much that I was victorious, but rather the message was that even arrayed against the unholy triumvirate, which has already been referred to, of Nixon and Reagan and Hoover, at a time when nobody believed that it was possible to effectively challenge them. Masses of people organized all over the world, in the US, of course, Here in France, I saw, when I was in jail, amazing photographs of my sister standing next to Louis Aragon, who incidentally was one of the literary figures I really studied and loved. And I couldn't believe that here he was, standing next to my sister, leading 100,000 French people with a demand for my freedom. And of course, all over the world, people were drawn to that campaign. And they were drawn to that campaign not so much because of who I was, but rather because people of all generations, communist and progressive people and trade unionists and women and people in Africa and in Asia and in Latin America decided to come together. And it was that impulse toward internationalism, that desire to create the kind of force that no one could be victorious over. That is the message that I think we need today. Because here we are in the second decade of the 21st century, and there are still many political prisoners. As a matter of fact, there's still people in prison who went to prison around the time that I was arrested. Lynette Peltier, for example, the Native American activist at Wounded Knee. One of the first things I did after my trial was over was to become a part of an organization we call the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. And one of our first cases involved Wounded Knee. And then we took on the case of Lynette Peltier. I think that was 1974, and he's still in prison. And Mumia Abu Jamal is still in prison. And Assata Shakur is not able to come home. I could spend the rest of the 10 minutes, and I've probably been talking more than 10 minutes. This is why I was reluctant, because I know that once I get going, it's hard to stop. But I could spend the next hour talking about cases of political prisoners. The Cuban 5, who are in prison because they attempted to give the FBI information on terrorists who were plotting to assassinate Fidel Castro, and they're in prison. So they're not only the cases of the individuals, but we've come to recognize, largely as a result of the work we did during that period depicted in the film, and people like George Jackson. George Jackson was really central in the creation of an analysis that allowed us to see that we had to take on the entire institution of the prison. It wasn't simply the individuals whose lives were claimed by that institution as a result of their political beliefs or activities. It was the institution itself. And so now many of us do work around what we call prison abolition. In the US, there are 2.5 million people behind bars. 25% of the world's incarcerated population, a disproportionate number of whom are Black or people of color, Latinos, for example. 25% of the world's incarcerated population and 5% of the population at large. So what does that mean? That means that the United States can be called a prison nation. And the technologies that have been developed in the US have been imported everywhere, all over the world, all over Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, in Palestine. The carceral technologies that are used inside prisons and in relation to prisoners are used in the West Bank throughout. In Gaza and the West Bank are the world's largest open-air prisons. So you see that without even talking about all of the issues that relate to war and relate to gender inequality and sexual inequality and the environment, there are major tasks that are before us today. And so this is why I thought it might be good for people to see a film about a case in which the people really won. Thank you.
Ms. Davis will answer questions,
yes.
Respond to questions from the audience. We have a mic, or two mics around here.
One.
Okay, and so would you please, the understanding being that we have to stop at 7:30, and so please make your questions brief and to the point so that a maximum number of questions can be asked.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes, you should probably use it so everyone can hear the question.
Hello.
I'll let you sort of point
Yes.
to people now.
Okay. My name is Julie Chancel. I'm very, very happy and very moved to meet you. I wanted to know, according to you, is there still a real left in the States, or is there a space left for a real left in the States? And according to you, what should come first in Obama's agenda, political agenda?
Okay, that's two separate questions, the left and Obama. I wish they were the same question. But unfortunately, we have to look at them separately. Yeah, the state of the left is a really complicated question today. I would say that there is very much a progressive impulse, and perhaps I can make the questions come together. Yes, and that progressive impulse can be seen by looking at the response to the last election. Many people were really afraid that Obama was not going to be reelected. You know, after all, there's quite a reactionary Republican mobilization against him. But then the people who were so excited the first time around were not so excited the second time because of the fact that his first administration was something of a disappointment to many people. And of course, there were those who expected him to change the world, to bring about a revolution. And some people weren't so naive, but as myself, I didn't expect that. But I did expect him to shut down Guantanamo, because he said he was going to do that. And not even that was done. But at the same time, I think it was the first election was an important victory for progressive forces, because it happened at a time when nobody believed that it was possible to elect a black man who identified with what is often referred to as the black radical tradition, the struggle for freedom against slavery, for civil rights, etc. No one believed that that was possible. And he was elected. And it seemed like the world had transformed. People celebrated everywhere, all over the world. And that was an important moment. And I think we should retain the promise of that moment. I don't want to give it up just because Obama was not the Messiah some people expected him to be. But then the second time around, there was a real question as to whether he would be reelected. And I think Romney really thought he was going to be elected. Because I remember thinking myself, I am not going to sleep until I hear Romney give his concession speech. Because I remembered 2000, when I went to sleep and Gore was the president, and then I woke up to an 8-year-long nightmare. So I decided I would stay awake until Romney gave his concession speech, which took a long, long time because he hadn't even written it. He had only written a victory speech. And as it turned out, he was probably expecting that all of the voter suppression strategies that were used would be successful. And especially in the South, in poor Black communities, where they set up not nearly enough voting places, polls, so that people had to stand in line for hours. And Romney and his people probably figured, well, maybe they'll stay in line for an hour or two, and then they'll get so impatient, and they'll say, well, this is not going to happen, and they'd go home. But people stood in line for 7 hours. In some instances, they stood in the same line for 7 hours. And I saw that, and it reminded me of South Africa, the first election of Nelson Mandela. And I said, you know, this is really a new day in the US. No one would have expected that before. So I think that the election tells us that there is the basis for building a new progressive left movement. And of course, there are a lot of organizations that continue to do the work that they've done over the years, but they're much smaller. It's the same thing in France. I remember during my campaign, the Communist Party of France was huge. And now that's not the case. We're confronting new conditions. But someone asked me if I was still a communist. And I said, well, I'm no longer a member of the Communist Party, but I still consider myself a communist. You know, maybe with a small c, but I'm still a communist. And I think, you know, as long as there is capitalism, you know, had capitalism been overturned by now, I don't think it would matter very much. But not only is capitalism alive and well, it's far worse than we could have ever imagined. It has insinuated itself into the lives of people all over the world, so that it's even more important today. And let me just give you one other example of why I think there is such promise. The Occupy movement. No one would have expected that this movement erupted within such a short period of time. And what it did, and this is true of the US, not so much true of France and Europe, but what it did in the US was that it made it possible for there to be serious conversations critical conversations about capitalism. And that had not been possible in the US since the 1930s. After the McCarthy era of the 40s and 50s, I was fired. You know, my first job, because I was a communist. So now it is possible to be critical of Wall Street and critical of capitalism. People talk about the 1% and the 99%. And I think that just because there are no longer encampments doesn't mean that that movement is dead. People are doing other things. It was important for a moment to cohabit the same space and to figure out how to address issues, the economic issues, the race issues, the gender issues, et cetera. And that was an amazing experiment. It was really quite remarkable. But the task that confronts us now is how precisely to build that powerful left movement that can put the kind of pressure on people in power, whether they be black or white. And especially now, we need to pressure Obama. We need to take 1 million people to Washington and tell them that our aspirations are no longer subordinate to the presidential agendas you have given us. This is what we think should happen. And hopefully we'll do that. Oh, that clock isn't working at all, is it? Okay. I was like timing myself with my answers, and I said, oh, I only spoke for less than a minute.
Yeah. Now, normally activists, and especially famous activists, avoid giving opinions about the political situation in the place they're visiting. However, if somebody asks you to say a few sentences about opposing racism in France, would you have something to say?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I would have a lot to say. You know, both historic, about the history and my own history, because I can tell you that many years ago, I kind of moved along a trajectory which I thought was moving me away from the venues of racism, going from the South to the North, and then going from the north of the United States to France. And I imagined France to be this, in my naivete then, you know, this kind of racial utopia. And I got here, my first visit to Paris was right in the middle of the Algerian War, and I was mistaken for an Algerian. So, so I learned something. This was back in 1961, I think. So I've actually followed the situation in France over the years, and I can say that whereas before it appeared to, well, let me put it this way. People in France, organizations, movements, have made extremely important contributions to the solidarity movements around racism, against racism in the US. And I could give an entire lecture on the contributions of French individuals and organizations to anti-racist struggles in the US. It seems today we're closer in terms of the modes of racism that exist because of global capitalism and because of the immigration that has been produced by globalization. We're confronting some of the very same issues. And it used to be that people preferred to use the term xenophobia and wanted to assume that xenophobia wasn't quite as bad as racism. Right. But I think now it's so clear that xenophobia draws on the modes and the ideologies of racism, and whereas we in the US historically focus on anti-black racism, we now have to deal with racism that's directed against so many different communities, including the Islamophobia, talking about France, that has emerged, especially in the aftermath of the so-called, or in connection with the so-called war on terror. And someone was just asking me a question about the veil issue, which I can't believe that in France there is this obsession, and especially among some feminists, with the veil. And as a result, of course, many women wear the veil as a mark of resistance, and they're probably far more feminist than the feminists who are criticizing them. And let me stop there, because I have too much to say. Do you? Oh. Okay. Yeah. No, you. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yes.
The black soldiers, when you had the black soldiers, American soldiers, you also had the tirailleurs, but they didn't have the same welcome. And I just wonder, as an black American, what do you make of that?
Did everyone hear the question? Okay, well, I can.
I was just asking Professor Davis, as an African American, what she makes of this fascination that the French always had and still have towards African Americans, people, music, culture, soldiers, in relation to the disdain or the inability to deal with their own blacks that their history produced throughout sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa.
Well, I think it's not only the French who have that affliction, but it's everywhere. I recounted a story in my autobiography when I was quite young, living. I grew up in the most segregated city of the U.S., where everything was literally segregated, and so my sister and I tried to play a joke on some merchants. In order to buy shoes, you had to go in the back. Black people were always forced to go and sit in the back. And so we walked into the store speaking French. And so I was the person who didn't know how to speak any English at all. And she knew a little bit. So they treated us like we were royalty. They let us sit in the front of the shoe store and brought out all of the shoes we could have ever wanted to see. And then, of course, towards the end, we reverted to our American Southern accents. But I say this because I think there's always the tendency to exoticize, certain people, whereas those who are most familiar are the ones subject to the kind of everyday racisms. And I've always been struck by the degree to which African Americans can be welcomed, so much so that there's quite a large community of exiles, of Black people who've left the U.S. because they've discovered much more freedom in France. It used to be the case. James Baldwin, for example, lived here for many years. Josephine Baker. I mean, we can go on and on talking about that. Whereas Black French people, or Black people from the French colonies, France is still a colonial power, which doesn't really get talked about that much. Guadeloupe, Martinique, and all of the other places. So that I think that any important struggle against racism has to very clearly point out that the racisms that are entrenched in the culture, and of course, people used to argue that, okay, it's not so bad. French racism is not as bad as British racism, or it's not as bad as racism in the U.S., because after all, if black people, whether they be from Guadeloupe or Martinique or Senegal or Mali, if they really learn how to speak French, right? If they learn French culture, then they're French. And I can remember, what was the name of the man who was the chair, the president of the Senate? Gaston Monaville, yes. I can remember having a conversation with him many years ago, and I asked him about racism in France, and he said, and he was so willing to offer solidarity against racism in the US. And so I said, well, tell me something about your experiences in France. Have you ever experienced racism? And he said, never, no, never. And we had a little argument about that. And I said, okay, well, what about the Algerians? What about racism, toward people from Northern Africa? So France is really complicated. And it's really, and I think the work that you have to do in France is going to be even more difficult than the US, because at least there's acknowledgement of the fact that racism has played such an important role in the historical trajectory of the US, whereas I don't know whether a lot of people would agree that that is the case with France. After all, you have Racine and Corneille, and you have, that is your history, right? So good luck.
Hello, Professor Davis. I have a question. I'm here.
You're where? Oh, right there. Okay. There's a light shining in my eyes.
I have a question that might follow up on what you just said. What do you think about, with the emergence of Black European studies, European scholars who think that
with the emergence of
Black European studies.
Oh, Black European studies,
yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Black intellectuals or intellectuals
yes.
from Europe, saying that the racial theory, the critical theory coming from the US is colonizing the field, and that we are copying some of the developments that have taken place in the US, and that we are wrongly trying to apply those models to the European context and the French context in particular. And my second question had to do with your understanding of radical multiculturalism today, because a few years ago you gave a speech in which you were discussing radical multiculturalism under the Bush presidency, the Bush II, and I was wondering how your understanding has evolved since then. Okay. And somebody here is asking me to ask you to give us advice for the new generation of activists.
Well, I don't know whether I should be giving advice, but let me think about it. But in response to the first question, it's quite interesting that you talk about Black ethnic studies scholarship, Black studies scholarship in the US colonizing Europe. And I can remember debates in the academy about the extent to which Black cultural studies from the UK was colonizing the field of Black studies in the US. And I don't know whether such debates are productive. I think we use the tools that work. We use the intellectual categories that help us to grasp material conditions. And as scholars, we always have to recognize that we're always trying to approximate what is and what can be. Our categories, our concepts, never fully grasp the social realities that they intend to grasp. And so when there are innovative modes of critical theory, regardless of where they're produced, whether they're produced in Europe, whether they're produced in Africa, there's a lot of really interesting work in relation to feminist studies that is coming out of the continent of Africa. And so we can use that. So, you know, the world is global. I mean, it's always been global. But of course, since global capitalism, there's been an emphasis on the fact that it's global, because the capitalists have realized that they're able to move across borders and transfer funds across borders and move corporations and factories across borders, even though they don't want people to cross borders, and they don't realize that the immigration that we have been witnessing is a direct result of that kind of globalization. It's okay for money to cross borders, but it's not okay for people to cross borders. So as long as we're able to draw productively from scholarship that is produced anywhere in the world, we should feel we should have a kind of intellectual internationalism. And this is important because intellectuals generally tend to imagine themselves as isolated, as working as individuals. And we've also learned how to develop this relationship of possessive individualism to the knowledge that we produce. And in my opinion, any knowledge that is worth producing is knowledge that is going to make a difference in the world. And wherever that knowledge makes a difference, we should try to utilize it without colonizing it. Let me say it's one thing to develop a kind of egalitarian relationship, and it's another thing to actually colonize or take over ideas that have been produced in other contexts. And of course, with the hierarchies of racism and the class hierarchies that are always in place, there's a tendency to forget often that some of the most important knowledge gets produced by people and communities that are not necessarily associated with these institutions in which knowledge is professionalized. So I always like to encourage my students to think about the various venues for the production of knowledge and learn how to acknowledge those modes of knowledge that generally don't make it into the footnotes. So it's all, if an academic, the notion of intersectionality, for example, and you probably are familiar with that term because most of you study, are most of you in American studies? Yeah? American history, So, and you know the term intersectionality, right? Does it exist in France? L'intersectionalité? In sociology. See, in the disciplines too, yes. Now, let me see how I can do a very short answer to this question. The notion of intersectionality, which many people refer to Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a legal scholar who teaches in critical legal theory, critical race theory at Columbia University and UCLA. But actually, for a very long time, there have been efforts, first of all, on the ground, activist efforts to figure out how to express the connections among race and class and gender. I mean, there was a time when people would say, well, is it more important for you to be a woman or a black person? As if you see, only academics think in those terms. Because analytically you can isolate these concepts, but in reality, you can't, right? And so many people were thinking, especially women of color, were thinking for a very long time. The Third World Women's Alliance, for example, in 1970, that had a newspaper that was called Triple Jeopardy. Triple Jeopardy, and that Triple Jeopardy was racism, sexism, and imperialism, because it was the time of the Vietnam War. So capitalism, but capitalism writ large, imperialism. And then you had many other activists who were trying to bring those issues together. And then it kind of made its way into the academy, and people started thinking about it's not additive, like a feminist philosopher by the name of Elizabeth Spellman developed this notion, this critique of the essential woman, right? And so she says that you can't have an additive approach. You can't add gender to race or race to gender, because if you add them, you can separate them. And so somebody else said, okay, well, instead of an additive approach, let's have a multiplicative approach, which means that we multiply it. But that's all, an approximation. And then, of course, intersectionality. And there was a major conference, feminist conference called Parallels and Intersections. And then the term intersectionality was developed, and we got stuck there. I mean, it's interesting that once it becomes inscribed into academic discourse, and especially disciplinary discourses, sorry about that, like sociology, it's really hard to move further, because that was actually a process, and we were attempting to understand the ways in which these categories are not only intersecting categories, but they're interwoven, and they're overlaying, and there are all kinds of terms that one could use. But now we have this term intersectionality, and people stop. You see what I'm saying? So I think whatever encourages us to continue thinking and developing innovative ideas and connections within the academy with what is happening on the ground. Thank you for that question. And this woman had she's had her, okay, you answer it, and then she'll be next.
Professor Davis, thank you for coming, and thank you for being such a great role model. And I was just wondering something. I just wanted to know, during your personal course as an activist, why did you choose to join the Communist Party instead of more typically black organization as the Black Panther Party, from which you were really close? So this is my question.
Well, I was actually a member of the Black Panther Party, and I actually was first involved in a number of black organizations, black liberation organizations. And I didn't join the Communist Party because I didn't think the Communist Party was radical enough. And that was largely because I associated the Communist Party with my parents. Because my mother wasn't a member of the Communist Party, but she was involved in a number of organizations that were created by black communists. And she had a lot of communist friends. As a matter of fact, during the McCarthy era, we used to get followed by the FBI because the FBI was looking for some of my parents' friends who were underground. So, you know, I always thought about communists as being the old people, right? And then when I decided to return from Europe to study in the US and also to become active in the Black movement there, I joined several organizations. One was SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, LA SNCC. I actually joined an organization. First it was called the Black Panther Party, the Black Panther Political Party, because there were a lot of Black Panther parties. Well, SNCC was the last organization, and that kind of fell apart because of the struggle over gender within the organization. And it was because it was an amazing organization. If I had time, I could tell you about some of the work that we did. But those of us who were women and were in the leadership of that organization were instructed by the top leadership that women shouldn't be in leadership. And so we had this big struggle, and I always point out it wasn't so much between the men and the women in the organization, because there were women who felt that women should be in the background, and there were men who felt that women should be in the leadership. But that organization fell apart. And I had been working with a number of Black communists who were my age, and you see them in the film if you'll Kendra and Franklin Alexander. And they were a member of a formation within the Communist Party. It was a club or cells, though some of you know the structure of Communist Party. And it was called the Che Lumumba Club. And it was actually a Black club within the Communist Party. So that was my entrance into the Communist Party. You know, not that I was only interested in things Black, because I've always had the sense that liberation is much broader than that. And my decision to join the Communist Party was in part a result of my desire to be able to make the connections between the labor movement and the anti-racist movement, and then of course the women's movement.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Je vais poser ma question en français, ça détonne un peu, mais c'est la langue que je maîtrise, on va dire.
Je vais essayer de comprendre.
D'accord, je vais aller doucement. Et bon, je suis ravie, j'aurais plein de questions sur l'islamophobie, le féminisme, les crimes policiers, mais ma question est plutôt, ce que je vais dire, c'est sur un cas concret d'un prisonnier politique du plus vieux d'Europe qui s'appelle Georges Ibrahim Abdallah sur la cause palestinienne. Georges Ibrahim Abdallah.
C'est un cas concret, c'est un cas de...
C'est-à-dire que la justice française, il est en prison depuis 29 ans, il est libérable depuis 12 ans.
Ah bon?
La justice s'est acharnée à ne pas le libérer et aujourd'hui elle a donné un avis positif pour sa libération, mais le gouvernement français refuse de le libérer par l'intermédiaire du gouvernement américain.
Est-ce qu'il y a un mouvement autour du...
Il y a un mouvement, oui, bien sûr.
Un grand mouvement? Un mouvement international?
International, oui. Grand mouvement en France, malheureusement, non. Mais sur la cause palestinienne, en général, non, aussi. Et donc...
Alors, Stéphane Hessel, les funérailles de Stéphane Hessel ont eu lieu ici, à Paris, il y a quelques jours, une semaine, 2 semaines. Alors, Stéphane, je l'ai connu parce que je suis membre du tribunal Russell sur la Palestine. Et je crois que le mouvement en solidarité avec la cause palestinienne va devenir beaucoup plus grand. Mais aux États-Unis, il y a un mouvement pour abolir les prisons, un mouvement abolitionniste. le mouvement abolitionniste du XXIe siècle. Alors, nous savons qu'il ne faut pas seulement regarder la situation des gens qui sont dans la prison, mais il faut aussi regarder la technologie carcérale qui est utilisée en la Palestine. La Palestine, c'est la plus grande prison, comment dit-on, open air, en plein air du monde. Et pour moi, j'essaie de mobiliser la communauté noire aux États-Unis parce qu'il y a une relation très forte entre les deux causes. Merci beaucoup pour la question. Ah bon, alors on va forcer maintenant.
No, this one will be in English.
Okay.
So just first, it's an honor to be here and to meet you. My question will be I wanted to know if a radical activist as Emma Goldman and a political position concerning free speech, prison, gender, class, and to some extent race had an impact on your approach to feminism and radical activism?
Yes, very much so. Yes, absolutely. I think Emma Goldman is one of those historical figures who continues to inspire those of us who try to make connections. I can remember when I wrote my first, actually it wasn't the first book, it was like the third book, I think, but it was on women, race, and class. I was very much inspired by the work of Emma Goldman. Also, what is so inspiring in the work and the life and work of Emma Goldman is the way she insisted on imagining struggle as pleasure. And we often tend to think about political struggles as sacrifice and pain and something that we really wouldn't be doing if we weren't so dedicated, right? If we weren't so committed, we would be having fun somewhere. We would be listening to music. We would be dancing. And so Emma Goldman showed us how it's possible to combine that impulse for joy and pleasure with the impulse for struggle for a better world. Thank you.